And he said once, if you're not at the hanging end. Almost as soon as he could walk, he learned to do his rope tricks. And that was only part of the magic. He was to work on the world all of his life. He used to claim that by age 4, he was lassoing turkeys, even though later a couple of turkeys on Broadway and in Hollywood evened the score. Eventually, though, this gum-chewing, rope-twirling cowboy comedian lassoed the laughter, the hearts, and the imagination of the whole nation. His name was Will Rogers, and this, the house that Jokes built, is his California ranch.
American Lifestyle, Will Rogers' California Ranch. Brought to you by Bassett Furniture Industries, world's largest manufacturer of fine furniture for every room in your home. And starring as your host, Mr. E.G. Marshall.
Will Rogers, who in the last year of his life stood at the height of world fame and ranked as the #1 box office movie star in America, even so, had never changed his name, his ways, his words, or his hat size to get there. For kings and commoners alike, and he knew plenty of both. He had one face, one set of rules, and one suit, I might add. Blue serge with a shiny backside. When he built this ranch home in Hollywood, when living in Hollywood really counted, the other movie stars were building as feverishly as the pharaohs. Shaping confectionery castles meant more to inhibit than inhabit. But not William Penn Adair Rogers. Will was a country boy, and he built himself a country boy house. He never stopped being a cowpoke, though by the time he lived here, the cows he poked best were the two-legged, sacred kind.
We must have some 80 or 90,000 people here tonight. That's the most people that ever paid to see a politician. Now, here tonight, Governor, you aren't allowed to refer to politics. They won't let anyone talk politics in here because this stadium was dedicated to art, sports, and any useful enterprises. He used to come to the Follies, and like all notables, I would ask him to get up and say something. And I would think he was going to get up and maybe say something nice about Ziegfeld's show. But he would get up and nominate Smith for something.
In this Hollywood town that's notorious for trying to find out who it is and worrying about who you are, Will Rogers never forgot who he was or where he came from. His life began in this house, in the long, hard horizon country between Claremore and Oolaga, Oklahoma, on November 4th, 1879. This was still Indian territory then, and Rogers was part Indian himself. My father was 1/8 Cherokee, and my mother 1/4 Cherokee, he said, which I figure makes me about 1/8 cigar store Indian. He joked, but he was proud and serious about his Cherokee ancestry. Will's father was Clement Van Rogers, a tough and enterprising rancher and banker who'd been a captain of Confederate cavalry. Will's mother was named Mary America Scrimshire, and she and Clem Rogers met in school in Tahlequah. They were married while both were still in their teens. Mary America gave birth to 8 children. Will was the youngest, and he was born in this room. His mother was an intensely religious woman and had hoped Will would be a preacher. She got her wish in a funny way. She also gets credit for giving Will his sense of humor. She died when Will was only 10 years old, but not before she had fixed in him the power of a heart without malice and a soul without smallness, as someone said it. Will's earliest lessons in life were riding and roping. And since his mother never fully recovered her health after Will's birth, he was mostly raised and taught by a black couple named Babe and Dan Walker. Babe taught him the Bible, and Uncle Dan taught Will to be the best rider and roper in the Indian Territory. Will's father gave him his first horse for his 5th birthday, and from then on, he was never happier than when he was on horseback, nor ever gloomier than when he was saddled with formal schooling. This is Will in 1897 as a cadet at Kemper Military School, one of several schools Will attended. He never graduated, and later explained it by saying, "I stopped just in time, or I would have been a senator." This is the stable barn at the California Ranch. And at one time, Will Rogers had nearly 50 horses here. From Kemper, Will ran off to Texas and worked as a cowboy, though he wasn't much good for work. Asked why he kept him on, the man who hired him said, "In the first place, he's so funny, I can't let him go. And in the second place, I'm just wondering if he can do anything. Can't fire him till I find out." Will's father was wondering also what was to become of this only son and tried to settle him down by giving him his own ranch and responsibility. But in July 1899, Will won first prize in a steer roping contest, and it settled him for certain on show business. That had quite an influence on my little career, he said. Once you're a showman, you're plumb ruined for manual labor again. Around this plain oak table on the patio sat some of the biggest, most important people in the land, but the food was always simple. Steak was Will's favorite, fried and well done. That old raw junk goes for the high collars in cities. They're kind of cannibalistic anyhow, as he put it. And he loved beans, plain white navies, cooked soupy, the kind that's meant to be eaten with a spoon, and cornbread. He didn't care for dessert, because if he had room for that, he said, he'd have eaten some more beans. But man does not live by cornbread and beans alone. By 1900, Will's father had remarried, and his sisters were married too. He was lonely and on the road. He'd been horsing around with rodeos and Wild West shows till finally he came home to mend from a gas explosion in a hotel room in San Francisco that almost cost him his life. At the same time, a young girl named Betty Blake from, oddly enough, Rogers, Arkansas, had come to visit her sister and brother-in-law in Oologah. I'll tell you about what a friend of theirs called the most perfect mating I've ever known right after this announcement.
We think it's nice that people are different. Take these two, for instance. Different. Now take them to where they live. Under all that tradition is an unconventional guy, and he shows it with cool contemporary furniture. Furniture you might expect from him. But he and his wife have chosen the warmth and charm of early American. And that's the nice thing about Bassett, because no matter what your lifestyle is, Bassett lets you show it. The whole idea is to express yourself, the way you live. That's why we make so many different styles. Bassett furniture makes a room complete, from the mirror on the wall to the headboard. And Bassett matches your changing lifestyles with solid value, so you can stick to a budget.
You'll be a good guy when we're gone.
We think it's nice that people are different, because no matter who you are or how you live, Bassett lets you show your style now.
The day I roped Betty, Will Rogers said on their 25th wedding anniversary, I did the star performance of my life. Though the truth is, he didn't rush his wooing any faster than he spoke his words. It was 8 years between the time they met and the day they married on November 25th, 1908, in Betty's family home in Arkansas. This painting of Mrs. Rogers hangs beside her husband in the living room of the California Ranch, the largest room in the house. It's 60 by 25 feet. All the furnishings are original, and as you can see, the decor is decidedly cowboy. The wooden walls and ceiling beams in this open and inviting space are stained redwood, and the chandeliers, if you can call them that, are a cattle neck yoke and a wagon wheel. The room is anchored by this rough stone fireplace surrounded by this head of a Texas longhorn, which was bound to get lassoed by Rogers during the course of an evening here, an evening in which you might meet John McCormick, the great Irish tenor, or Douglas Fairbanks Sr. and Mary Pickford, or Charlie Chaplin. They all came here, and we're lucky if they didn't get roped themselves with their arms pinned to their sides. It's a social hazard in the Rogers household. All the rugs and throws here are hand-woven Navajo Indian work. At the far end of the room is the indoor dining area, a feature that was very innovative at the time. And here are two wonderful paintings from the collection by the fine Western artist Charles Russell, who was Will Rogers' good friend and a frequent house guest here. There's an interesting story about this picture window. It wasn't here when the house was first built, But Flo Ziegfeld, the great Broadway producer, and we'll talk more about him soon, used to love the view, but he had to go out on the porch to see it. So one day, while Will and Betty were away, he summoned in workmen to tear down the wall and put in this picture window, which of course he paid for. And as Will described it, one day here comes a big truck with a load of glass and some men who begin knocking out the end of my house without asking me anything about it. And there you are. This stuffed calf was bought by an artist friend for Will to lasso so that his guests could relax. This hurdy-gurdy was usually going full song, and Rogers sang zealously at the top of his trembling tenor. He said once, "I got a voice that's got everything but a satisfied listener." By the time they built this house in 1924, there was no longer any question of Betty's deep love for this overgrown boy, for the shock of hair falling over his forehead, or for his life in show business. Incidentally, this swing was on their front porch in their former house in Beverly Hills. But back at the beginning, it was Betty's serious doubts about Will's character and future that kept the couple apart for so long. Betty was a sheltered small-town girl, and she was frequently nonplussed by Will's colorful language, fractured grammar, and open wit, not to mention her fears about the moral and financial perils of the entertainment world. Still, she was immensely attracted to him and refused to break off completely, though she also kept refusing his proposals of marriage. She just couldn't see making a home out of a string of theatrical hotel rooms or having for her hope chest a battered suitcase with travel stickers all over it. So Will went around the world, and Betty stayed in Arkansas, hoping he'd come back and settle into the rancher she wanted him to be. Finally, though, there was no one else for either of them, and what's more, Will was succeeding. Betty knew because he sent her all his clippings. Following a hit tour of European capitals, Will showed up at Betty's door and asked again. This time the answer was yes. We'll go upstairs and I'll tell you about Will in the Ziegfeld Follies right after this announcement. This is Will and Betty's bedroom. Here, clearly, the cowboy Indian deferred to his wife. The room has a softer, more feminine feeling. Betty and Will Rogers had 4 children together, 3 sons and 1 daughter. One of the sons, Fred, died early of diphtheria, misdiagnosed as tonsillitis. Another, Will Jr., went on to become a congressman and newspaper owner. He played his father in the film biography called The Will Rogers Story. After their marriage, Will and Betty Rogers took their honeymoon on the vaudeville circuit, where Will was doing well. He might be doing it all of his life, warned his very good friend, theatrical star Fred Stone. Fred advised him to stay put in New York for a while, so he could be seen by the people who could make him a star. Will took his friend's advice and worked in a couple of Broadway revues where he was seen by Gene Buck, right-hand man to Florian Ziegfeld. Buck persuaded Ziegfeld to try Rogers in Midnight Frolics. Rogers got laughs all right, but ran dry on material since the crowd who came to Midnight Frolics was mostly rich regulars rather than transients, and they got to know his act as well as he did. Then Betty Rogers, who had once made the mistake of offering to help her husband correct his wayward grammar, only to be sharply informed that that was their bread and butter, ventured another suggestion. She said Will ought to talk about what he read in the papers every day. It'd give him a new act every night, and so it did, and set him on the way to becoming a legend.
This country is bigger than any man or any party. They couldn't ruin it even if they tried.
We're on the balcony overlooking the living room leading to the guest rooms. The family bedrooms were in a separate wing across the patio. Rogers became the rumpled rage of New York in the very next season, 1916, went into the Follies and became a star. After getting him to make one movie in New York, Samuel Goldwyn coaxed Will to come to Hollywood to make several movies. That was in 1919.
He and Betty and the children came west, and Will made a dozen pictures during the term of his 2-year contract. None of them was very good, but none of them was really bad. And they all did fairly well at the box office. But Will was a disappointment to himself and to the studio. They didn't renew his contract, and he returned to New York and the Follies. He also began writing a humor column for the Times. For a fellow writing humor every day, it didn't hurt to have the Republicans putting Harding in the White House and Prohibition putting gin into the nation's bathtubs. This was Will's typewriter and desk. We're in the study now, Will's workroom, where he continued to write his national column when he came back to Hollywood for a second try at pictures. Here are a few quotes from his column called Will Rogers Says. The income tax has made more liars out of the American people than golf has. You want me to tell you the latest political jokes, President Harding? You don't have to, Will. I appointed most of them. Prohibitionists lay all the divorces onto liquor. I say it's marriages. A couple don't look near so good to each other over a water decanter as over just emptied champagne bottles. We're all ignorant on different subjects. Will Rogers came back to Hollywood in 1923, this time for Hal Roach. But again, something was wrong with his pictures. Betty thought it was because he wasn't being himself, and director Rob Wagner agreed. He and Will finally got the studio to let them do a picture where Will acted natural. The movie was a big success. But even so, the moguls weren't convinced. They thought it was an accident, and once more stuck him into a series of vulgar little two-reelers. When his contract was up, back to the Follies he went. But now, there was radio also, and Will's voice was ubiquitous in the land.
Now listen, don't let him knock Mr. Hoover too much. Just let him go see some of these other countries and come back. He looks good after you've been over there, brother.
What better invention could there be for a man who liked to talk as much as Will Rogers? Will went to Washington during this period for a press dinner, and Nicholas Longworth, then Speaker of the House, volunteered to take Rogers to the White House to meet the president. Calvin Coolidge was the resident this time, and the taciturn New Englander had a formidable reputation for never laughing. On the way in, Longworth bet Will he couldn't make Coolidge laugh. Will took the bet, and when he was introduced to the president said, "Beg your pardon, I didn't catch the name." Coolidge roared with laughter. Happy as an insurance salesman, Will described him. At the same press dinner, Will met General Billy Mitchell, who took Will up in a plane the next day, and then and there converted him into a zealous advocate of aviation. I'll tell you more about that right after this announcement.
Fine flight, Ben. Right.
Okay, a little more to your left.
Look, could you be a little careful?
Your first apartment. It's a big day and an important one when your new furniture arrives.
Beautiful, Ken.
Oh, sure
It's the
is.
beginning of your life together. Through your life, you'll show your style in a lot of different ways. The way you live and dress.
That's all right.
And the wide variety of beautiful Bassett furniture lets you show your style, too.
Thank you, Jim.
In your first home, when your style changes, the value of Bassett lets you show that change and still stick to a family budget with good furniture that lasts.
Please, you're going. I'm going to ask Susan to marry me, Dad.
Another big day when he decides on a lifestyle of his own.
What are we going to do with this big old house? Huh?
Then as your life continues to change, Bassett reflects that change with taste and quality. From your first beginning to your first grandson, Bassett lets you show your style now.
This is the library, and this was also the family's private living room. Betty played the piano nicely, and guess who sang? Will's favorite songs were "Hello, My Baby," and "I May Be Crazy, But I Ain't No Fool." There are over 500 volumes here, and at least a third of them are personally autographed to Will and Betty. Here's one from Theodore Roosevelt. In 1928, Will ran a mock campaign for president as the candidate of the anti-bunk party, and the humor magazine Life dubbed him the people's real choice and therefore the unofficial president of the United States. No one objected to the title. By now, Will had taken on the dimensions of an institution in American life and was loved by everyone.
There's not a product that you can name that we haven't got more of it than any country ever had in the face of the earth. And yet we've got people starving. We'll hold the distinction of being the only nation in the history of the world that ever went to the poorhouse in an automobile.
Oh yes, Will was making movies again for the third time. But this time, they were all right. And they were talkies. Is it any wonder they were successful now? He was being himself, and talking was his life.
Panic is just like a war. You can talk yourself into one, but you got to fight your way out.
A panic is a condition of the mind.
That's right, sir. That's right.
Panic is a condition of the pocketbook. And the only thing will cure it is a good dose of spending. And the government's got to spend some money, too, before this...
What about the taxpayer? It's his money they're spending.
Well, it's his panic, too, ain't it?
There is no swimming pool at the California Ranch, that traditional symbol of Hollywood success. Will said, I don't want a bunch of naked bodies running around. If you want to swim, go to the beach, which is what Betty and the children did. He also said there's more swimming pools in this town than Bibles. But oddly enough, it seems at first, there is another symbol of the rich that is here, a polo field.
If it strikes you as being incongruous that an old cowhand common man like Will Rogers would have a polo grounds, remember that he was an extraordinary horseman and that there just aren't many horse games but polo. And real life doesn't always follow the script. Neither did Will in the movies he was making.
He preferred to make up the lines as he went along. John Ford once scolded him, "Do you have the faintest idea what this story is about?" "I don't," Will drawled. "You sort of break the news to us gently, and then the fellow who can remember the plot gets the first prize." Will liked making movies, but he was much more interested in politics and flying. I'll tell you about it right after this announcement. Will Rogers had become a prophet and visionary on the subject of aviation. It came as no surprise to him when Charles Lindbergh electrified the world with his solo flight from New York to Paris, though most folks even then looked on flying as a kind of circus trip and refused to see the implications for peace and war in the flying machine.
Another good friend of Will's and a fellow Oklahoman was Wiley Post, the one-eyed flying pioneer who had set the world's record for the fastest flying time around the world. Will himself was doing considerable traveling around the world. Will and his family set out for a trip to Asia and finally to Western Europe. All his columns from this trip kept their sense of humor, but there was foreboding wisdom under the wit.
Mr. Roosevelt told me when I come over here, he says, "Now, Will, don't you go over there and jump on Japan. You just keep them from jumping on us."
In the late summer of 1935, Will Rogers decided to make another journey, this time to Alaska, in the company of his old friend Wiley Post. It was to be the last. Will and Wiley, out of Fairbanks heading north, decided to land in an isolated region along the way to Point Barrow, which had been their destination. They came down to talk to some Eskimos they'd spotted from the air. After a short visit, they got back into the little plane, and Wiley took it up.
When they were just barely airborne, the plane's engine coughed and stopped, and the plane banked over to the right and plummeted nose first into the icy waters of a shallow Arctic river. Will Rogers was dead, and when the world found out, for the first time, the mention of his name brought tears instead of laughter. When they told Betty, she said, "It can't be. I love him too much." And that said it for everyone, from hobos to the highest born. Will Rogers is buried in this memorial in Oklahoma, in the land of his birth. A comedian commemorated like a king. What counted so much about this man? This folksy cowboy with his rope and some ungrammatical jokes, who got away with calling America Cuckoo Land and Washington, D.C. the Fun Factory, was funny and wise. and spoke about complex matters in simple, everyday words so even statesmen could understand. But mostly, I think everybody loved him because they knew he couldn't hate them. It may seem naive and embarrassingly sentimental today, Rogers' idea about never meeting a man, but in context, said that in a frightened world to remind people they were hating a lot of people they'd never met. And that's a reminder. One thing is certain, after you visited this California ranch of his and rubbed against his spirit, you do know clearly why nobody ever met a man who didn't like Will Rogers.
American Lifestyle. Will Rogers' California Ranch. Brought to you by Bassett Furniture Industries and the more than 20,000 Bassett dealers throughout the country. And starring as your host, Mr. E.G. Marshall.